Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 13 of the Daily Grind. My name is Michael Price. For those who haven't tuned in before, I am your host. Hopefully, you got your cup of coffee. If you see my breath, it's because I forgot to turn the heater on in this room last night, so you could say it's a little bit chilly. Thankfully, I do have my coffee, and I am ready to search for some clarity. I hope you are as well. We have been going over the rules of engagement of how we're going to interact on this podcast. If you haven't viewed the last couple of previous episodes, maybe starting at episode 10, I'd say 10, 11, 12, they're all kind of going to help point in the direction of where we're headed today. It's really grouped together. If you get the opportunity to look at those, I think it would be helpful. Today, we are going to talk some about fallacies. Um, but as I was telling you the other day, the purpose of why I developed these laws of engagement to begin with is because with a long list of fallacies, it just becomes impossible nearly to remember them all, or at least it takes a lot of training and how to apply them in certain situations, and even if you do, it doesn't necessarily account for what happens next when someone commits a fallacy. What does that mean? Does it get called out? How do we process that in terms of what comes next? And so I find these to be limitations when we talk about fallacies. What I brought up when I was making the laws of engagement is a category in regards to when to terminate a conversation. I end up rephrasing it because it's more about taking a break. If the ultimate goal is seeking truth, you never want to end a conversation permanently. You just want to give people the proper amount of time to learn to rethink how they're approaching it, or maybe say it in a different way, or form a better argument, because the ultimate goal is that we are all growing as a community, as friends, as people who actually have an earnest desire to know what's real and what really matters. And I think that's it's not that I think, it's that I know that's the purpose of this podcast to begin with, and I know that's the purpose of the book series as well. For those who don't know about the book series, you can look it up at burdenofproof.co. That'll take you to the shop page on the Burden of Proof Publishing website, where you can purchase the second book. But the first book, The Flaw, is actually available free. You just hit out to add to cart, hit a couple more buttons. It won't actually ask you for any information. It won't cost you anything, and you can go ahead and download that right now. It's just a fictional story of a character named Marcus. He's going through a variety of struggles in his life. Uh, y'all probably know the phrase, when it rains, it pours, and that's exactly what Marcus is going through. Everything in his life is collapsing around him, including the house that he lives in, and he learns to examine not just the flaws outside, but the flaws inside, and begins the process of rebuilding the way that he thinks. And so I hope if you get the opportunity that maybe you'll check that out. Maybe this is a better form of learning for you in a video or audio type format. So if that works for you, that's awesome as well. I do intend to have the books as a audiobook eventually, but I am pretty busy right now, so that could take a while. I wouldn't put my money on that being very soon if I was you. But as I was mentioning, we're going to talk today about this category of termination or taking a break. And it's not about when I want or you want or anybody thinks the conversation should be over. It's about when a conversation is no longer productive. You probably inherently know when this is a lot of the time. For example, when you've stated something 3 to 4 different ways and a person just can't seem to understand what you're saying. Maybe it's your own fault for an inability to be able to express it the way it needs to be expressed in that particular moment. Maybe it's their fault because they're too frustrated to be able to interpret the data that you're giving them in an unbiased manner. Maybe you're tired. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're stressed about some things that you said earlier in that day and they haven't left the conversation that you were in 45 minutes ago to realize that you're in a completely different conversation now. All of these I would call the law of cognition. It's basically just a point in time when you recognize that the cognitive function at that moment is no longer able to properly process the information that it's being given or the information that it's giving. So, this happens to me as well as anybody else when I get extremely tired, or I've had times in my past where there were just too many circumstances going on, and I was trying to think about things far beyond what I was capable of in that moment. And sometimes that's going to be hard for us to recognize. And sometimes on this podcast, when a someone joins actually onto the podcast to go live with me or with me and my co-host, you may not feel at that moment like that's an issue. I will go above and beyond to try to clarify in that moment to give it every opportunity to move forward in the conversation. But once I've recognized this, I'm gonna point out, hey, we're having a little bit of a cognition problem. Not because you're necessarily not understanding. Maybe me. I'm not sure what it is right now. It could be either one of us causing this issue, but can we take a little bit of time, take a break, come back to this conversation another day? Maybe I can find a better way to phrase it. Maybe you won't be as tired or as stressed, or vice versa. So that would be the law of cognition. Now, before I go any further into any of these, what the overarching subject here, I would call this hedging. Now, when it comes to, I've used a lot of AI recently, and it uses a lot of affirmation language and a lot of hedging. It tries to soften your arguments and tries to not give direct answers. And maybe this isn't every AI platform, but so far it's every one that I've worked with. And I'm sure they have their reasons for being designed that way because it keeps you coming back for more conversation. It keeps the conversation flowing. And that can be good. So, it can also be distracting from what we actually need to get done in life. But the point about the hedging is, overall, I would just consider it a way of avoiding giving a direct answer. Now, for a lot of people, at a lot of times, this isn't going to be intentional. It's not like there's this malice of, I don't want the truth and I'm not going to tell you anything. Sometimes that exists. Usually that's a defense mechanism of being attacked for what they've said before, or um, being incorrect and feeling embarrassed or ashamed about not having the right answer at the time. And so that's completely understandable. We develop these hedging mechanisms as a way to avoid that embarrassment, that frustration, that feeling that leaves us in a state of discomfort. And so that's completely understandable. Now the question is, what am I supposed to do on my end when I see this hedging? And you could leave it up to circumstance, but I recognized a problem with that. If I left it up to circumstance about what I would do in that particular situation, then people would feel as if I was cutting off the conversation because they were just making maybe a valid point and I didn't want to hear it, or that their phrasing was correct and I just didn't like it. And so the reason this episode is so necessary is so that we don't end up with that problem. that there is a standard set ahead of time. Now, am I allowed to be lenient on it? Yes, and I will do my best to be lenient. But when I can recognize that a conversation isn't going anywhere, it's time to take a break. I'm not saying we're stopping forever. I'm not saying I don't want to hear your point. I'm saying that if we continue with what we're already doing, people are not going to benefit from it, including us. So let's stop for a moment. Let's take a break. And these type of things, and actually, let me go ahead and finish that. If it's done once, I'm definitely going to be lenient about it. I'm going to point out what the form of hedging was, because I can't even discuss every form of hedging that exists today. Um, so some of it's going to be a matter of what we encounter throughout the course of conversation. What I will attempt to do is to give a list on the website of the different forms of hedging. But the main thing is, I'm telling you up front in this episode right now, if I recognize a form of hedging and I explain why it's hedging, that's going to count as the warning. The second one means we're going to have to take a break from the conversation. Now, what I explained at the end of the day yesterday, I believe, and on episode 10, is that there will be a time period which you can come back. So, for the first time, there's an issue, 1 day. For the second time, 3 days. For the third time, 7 days. Then 14. Then 1 month. Then 3 months. And once again, the idea of this is to be intentional in how we speak to one another, how we communicate with one another. The idea isn't to end the conversation, it's to make sure that the next time we talk, it can be more profitable for us and everybody around us. So, once again, first time's a warning. I'll explain the form of hedging. The second time, I call it the law of evasion. That shows that, we've already done this once. You're repeating the behavior. At that point, if you backtrack and you go, hey, that was a slip, then of course I'm gonna try to be lenient. The goal isn't to end the conversation. The goal is to keep it going. So that's kind of how it's going to work. Like I said, I'm going to err on the side of leniency, but there is a rule that is set in place that if you commit the same error twice, so say you attack my character, I'll let it go once. This is called, and I'm just going to throw the name out there so maybe y'all can start getting familiar with it, because you're going to hear it in other contexts in your life. But that one's called like an ad hominem. So when somebody attacks you as a person rather than attacking your arguments. So this would just be a form of hedging. What it really is avoidance of the actual conversation at hand. So there's that type. There's types like a straw man. Really, that just means you misrepresent my position, because my position, it may be actually difficult to argue with. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a new position over here that's not the same thing, so you can knock it down to look like you've won the argument. In a debate format, if your goal is winning, that might work. But in a situation where we're trying to seek the truth, it's the opposite of effective, and it will end in us terminating the conversation, taking a break till next time. So there's a lot of them like that. Another one that comes to my mind right off the bat is using terms like metaphysics. That's fine if you want to talk that way in the theoretical when it comes to another debate or in your daily life conversation. I personally wouldn't advise it too much, because actually I wouldn't advise it at all, because it muddies the water. It blurs the line between what's real and what's not real. Speaking of things that are real as if they're not, or speaking as of things that are not real as if they are. And that's not the way life works. It either is or it isn't. A thing is what it is. And that's one of the things we'll delve into early on next week. But for today, we'll give that one a rest. But the point being, if we discuss, well, metaphysically speaking, that just means we're not going to speak in terms of definites. We're not going to make a testable claim. And the whole point of this podcast is to make testable claims. So that type of language doesn't have any place on this podcast. As I said, you can choose to use it in your daily life. I still wouldn't advise it because it's not a productive form of conversation. Now, when I was looking up fallacies today, because as I've told y'all, I'd rather skip the whole conversation about fallacies in the first place. What I mean by that is, I think we can set some ground rules that are much similar, or very similar, but much more efficient. What I mean is, instead of describing each way you could go wrong, create a simpler set of rules that prevent you from going wrong in the first place. And that's what these laws of engagement are. And so I definitely want you to go back and check out the prior ones. And by next week, probably Sunday or Monday, I imagine that I will have the list of these laws of engagement up on the website and probably on the social media pages as well, so that anyone who is wanting to come onto the podcast in the future has easy access to those to know exactly what they're agreeing to. And when I was looking into fallacies, I'm going to go ahead and pull it up here. The first thing that I noticed is them trying to distinguish between formal fallacy and informal fallacy. I'm just going to read this to you because I'm going to point something important out. It says a formal fallacy is untrue because the form or structure of the argument but not necessarily the content or the context. In other words, the relationship between the premise and conclusion lacks logic. Informal fallacy. An informal fallacy is untrue because of the content or context of the argument, even if it is logical in its form. For example, the premise itself may be irrelevant or a misinterpretation of truth. Okay, but what I wanted to point out is what we were discussing a few days ago, term distinction. Right here, we're using the same term fallacy, and we add an adjective to it. And so what that's called is the law of adjectives. It basically just says, it's the law of composition. When we add another adjective to something, like this, it's basically that it makes it an entirely new thing. So either one is a fallacy, they're both a fallacy, or neither of them are a fallacy. But what you don't have is an option where they're all the same thing. And so the idea that we're using the same term here can end up creating confusion because realistically, they're both just a fallacy. Whether you call it formal or informal has no significance on whether or not an argument was improperly formed. And so that's something we're going to pay attention to. Technically, that can be considered a form of hedging, is to basically muddy the terms up a little bit. I would say in context of our podcast here, the only time that would be considered hedging is if I'm trying to dignify one as a distinct term. So if I just said, instead of, we'll call this one that's formal fallacy up here, we'll just call that fallacy. And we'll call this one down here informal, that's informal fallacy. We'll call it some random word. We'll just say Zova. Some made up word that you come up with. And I ask if that's all right so we can distinguish our terms, and you're like, no, these are real terms. And I go, I understand what you're saying, that they're real terms, but I don't want you to say the word fallacy later on and then us I don't want you to say the word fallacy later on and then us be confused as to which one you're talking about. But by the way, for when I repeat myself like that, it's because sometimes the Facebook signal goes out in here, and I want to make sure that the people on Facebook are able to hear the full content here. But I was just pointing out that when you add an adjective, just like we've said in our previous episodes, if you want to check those laws out, again, episodes 10 through 12 are going to tell you a whole lot more about these type of concepts and how these rules are actually broken down. But let's just touch on a couple of these fallacies and just see why they even happen in the first place and how these laws of engagement could prevent something like that. A false dichotomy is basically just presenting two things against one another that aren't necessarily against one another. So it's like a false framework, a false framing of an argument. Now, if there is ever a false dichotomy, in reality, it's because they are making two different claims. Because every claim is either true or it's false. It's a binary statement. There is no false dichotomy when it comes to a singular claim. So if you're witnessing an actual false dichotomy, which I would say doesn't really exist when you understand that you're only making one claim at a time, then it appears as if there's some dilemma that doesn't actually exist. I'm just trying to think of a good example. I may not have one on the spot, but I'll try to clarify the language for you. If I make a claim about this cup, that it's sitting on the table, the answer is either yes or no. But if I make a claim that this cup is sitting on the table and also on the floor at the same time, then it's either sitting on the table or, let me rephrase it, it's either sitting on the table or it's sitting on the floor. Well, once I do that, I have prevented the option of, for example, it sitting over here on the arm of my chair or it being in my hand. So that's a false dichotomy in the sense of what they would call it, but my understanding of it is that it isn't really a false dichotomy. It's you made two different claims at the same time. One claim that it was on the table and one claim that it was on the floor. Once we separate those two claims, then we don't have that problem anymore. And that's why claim isolation, putting it down to one claim at a time, is one of the laws of engagement that we have, so we can avoid that problem altogether. All right, let's see if we got a couple more examples like that. It says ad hominem, straw man. We kind of went over those. Slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope just means you've done this, you've had this one argument that's a much smaller argument, and you're saying it's like if you get a speeding ticket one day, you're going to murder somebody. It just doesn't follow. It's making an assumption. But once again, what people don't realize is that's just making a bunch of claims, stacking a whole bunch of claims, and you never proved any of them. So claim isolation, say, okay, we're not talking about all that right now. We're only talking about this one speeding ticket. So once again, it prevents that as well. Let's see, maybe we'll go through one more. Appeal to authority. So appeal to authority means to give credence to an argument based on who says it. And so if we apply the burden of proof, it has nothing to do with who says it. Who says it doesn't count for evidence. So once again, that one would be avoided. The whole point is, I think there's something like 42 on this page. I saw another page say there was over 200 different fallacies on it, and it would be aimless to go through all of these, and it would be unlikely that most of us would be able to learn them, including myself, because the list is so extensive. Yeah, I know some of these, and I know quite a few more, but it's unrealistic to think that we're going to learn them all, much like our legal system. Sorry, I was just trying to get a wise one in there, but there, our legal system is like that. It has more laws than we can even count, and laws that contradict each other regularly. Not just contradict each other between like local and like regional and state level and federal, they actually contradict each other even on a local level. And when you move from 1 inch to the left to 1 inch to the right, whose jurisdiction you're in, what law applies to you, it changes, and there's just no way to keep up with all of them. So I just find that interesting, and especially considering with all this application of the laws of logic, um, how do we have laws that contradict each other in the same sense, in the same context? It really just, at the same time, it just doesn't make any sense to me. Um, and by that, I mean it doesn't make any sense to anyone at all, period. It's just, I guess at this point, so overcomplicated and unwillingness to start cutting away those things that disagree, it just seems probably insurmountable. But we won't stay too much on that subject. I'll get off my soapbox for that one. We can discuss that one maybe another day in the future. Um, all of this to say, all of these are forms of hedging. If you come and you attack me, you get loud, you get angry. I'm still gonna assume that this is not because you're out to get me, but because you're trying to if to not answer the question at that moment. Maybe just unintentionally, maybe a defense mechanism. So I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to give you an opportunity to change it. If you're misrepresenting me or my point that I've made, I'm going to give you an opportunity to change it. Um, if we can't understand each other, I'm going to try to re-explain. I'm going to try to figure out what exactly it is that you're saying. I'm going to try to make sure we're distinguishing terms correctly. And that's another one. If you're unwilling to distinguish your terms, you want to keep your terms the same, and we just can't have the conversation. If you're using a term in multiple ways in the context of the same conversation, the claim's no longer testable. This conversation can't be productive anymore. We're going to need to take a break. I'm going to explain why. But if there's an absolute refusal, there's just no way we can move forward with that. So I will try to have an exact list when on the day when we actually do the first live to let on people from whatever venue we're at. I will go over them one more time. I will have a more full list at that point in time. But for now, I think this is sufficient for showing you the type of things that are considered hedging. It really is just any form of avoidance of answering the question. If you're not willing to give a yes or no when I've posed a binary claim, you say yes and no, and I go, okay, we're in a truth-seeking environment here. That's the purpose of this podcast. I don't want to like frustrate you on or put you on the spot. And if you don't want to continue the conversation, that's fine. But I only made one claim, so it's either true or it's false. Now, if you need more time to evaluate that, that's absolutely fine. But we're at a point where you need to give me either a true or false before we can move to the next step. And so there is no partial truth. There is no yes and no. There is no kinda, sorta. A thing either is or it isn't. And this is probably going to feel a little uncomfortable for you. It was a little uncomfortable for me when first learning it. But if we don't learn to think that way, we're not even making testable claims in the first place. Without testable claims, there is no progress. We can't learn about truth. So, as I said, that's the purpose of these laws of engagement. And I really only bring them up because ultimately I want us to have civil discourse. I want it to be productive. I want it to be enjoyable. I want it to be fun and productive. And I want you to leave feeling like we've both gained something from the conversation, not belittled each other, not talked around the argument the entire time. I don't want you to leave feeling like I feel after watching a typical debate, just completely unsatisfied. Like they just argued around each other, talked past each other, yelled at each other, belittled each other, and I'm not sure if they even ever talked about the point. And even if they did, how did they prove what they were saying was evidence in the first place? Or when it wasn't certain evidence, did they at least frame it in the right way to show that it's only true within a certain set of conditions? Or are they just asserting thing after thing after thing, usually multiple things in the same span of speech of 30 seconds? You got like 10 different claims, and you're like, it just leaves you feeling confused. And a lot of the time, at least for me when I was younger, I couldn't even tell why I was so frustrated after hearing conversations like that. And so I hope that we can all abide by these rules, including myself. Each person will be asked to affirm all of these rules before coming on to the show. I'm so excited about being able to go live, not just for the sake of testing this method that's actually going to get started tomorrow, where we go over the first law, and I'm very very ecstatic, and I'm looking forward to that. But I'm more looking forward to getting to know each of y'all, and hearing about your experience, your lives, and and the purpose of this method doesn't end at finding out that a truth exists. It ends in figuring out what that means for our lives. It ends in how can, if this method can reveal that the truth is real, identifiable, and possible to understand in our daily lives, even above, the daily grind. If that's true, what would be the recourse of that? What does that mean for our future? Does that mean maybe every decision doesn't have to leave us feeling like we have no idea what we're doing? Is it possible to know what a right decision actually is? And how much comfort could it bring if that were true? And so the end goal is to bring this into reality. But I'm ready to start that right now. I've done enough testing of this method to be comfortable with the possibility of encountering situations and circumstances of real life that I don't have to know the answer beforehand. I'm not going to try to plan out every possible conversation, because no one can do that. And speaking in hypotheticals at a certain point is just no longer productive. If it's in the near future and you have evidence of which direction a thing leads, then thinking about that may help. But if you're thinking in terms of what could happen in a conversation 6 weeks from now at the grocery store, which some of us do, believe it or not, um, have similar type thoughts. Not necessarily that particular one, but we do have similar type thoughts of trying to plan things that we have no evidence to suggest will ever happen. And so I would just say, for those of you who do decide to come on to the show, uh, to be willing to dive into the claims and be willing to test the beliefs, the identities that you've inherited in your life. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be tough. For me, it's been really tough at times. It's like when you see an onion and you're peeling back the layers. I'm sure you already feel like that sometimes. That's what truth feels like. That's what growth feels like. And sometimes it's going to take discomfort in order for that to happen. but I hope that you're willing to take that journey and to question. Well, I'll give you the tagline of the whole book series, of the whole podcast. I hope that you're willing to test everything and hold fast to what is true. And hopefully, I'll see you for tomorrow morning's episode of the Daily Grind, where, as I said, we're going to get into the first actual law that describes existence and truth itself, if the truth exists. But we're going to call it the law of reality. So I hope you'll be back for tomorrow's episode. It should be about the same time as today. I think I got on at about 6:40 a.m. this morning. Could be anywhere from 6:30 to 7 a.m. I appreciate anyone who's listening now and those who will listen in the future. So enjoy your day and try not to get caught up in the daily grind.